August 12, 1942. Chesapeake Bay, the USS Cleveland. The brand-new light cruiser sat in calm waters, her crew manning battle stations for what was supposed to be a 2-day test. Above them, 3 small drone aircraft buzzed through the sky, radio-controlled targets that would give the gunners a challenging workout. The Navy had brought something new to test, something so secret that most of the crew didn't know what made these particular shells different from the thousands of rounds they'd fired before. The scientists watching from the observation deck were nervous. They'd spent 2 years developing this technology, 2 years of failures, explosions, shattered prototypes, and problems that seemed impossible to solve. The gun crews loaded the special ammunition. Regular 5-inch shells on the outside, but inside each one was something that shouldn't have been possible. A miniature radio set with vacuum tubes that had to survive being fired from a cannon. The first drone made its pass. The guns tracked. Fired. The shell exploded near the target. The drone disintegrated. The second drone. Another burst. Another kill. The third drone never finished its evasive maneuver. 4 shells, 3 targets destroyed. The test that was supposed to take 2 days ended in 1 morning. The scientists on the observation deck were speechless. The gun crews didn't understand why everyone was so excited. They just hit 3 targets. What was the big deal? The big deal was this. They had just witnessed the combat debut of the proximity fuse, a device that would kill more enemy aircraft than any other weapon in World War II. A technology so revolutionary that General George Patton would later say it required a full revision of the tactics of land warfare, a secret guarded as closely as the atomic bomb itself. And it had just worked perfectly. 2 years earlier, nobody thought it could be done. The problem was simple to understand, but seemingly impossible to solve. When you fire an anti-aircraft gun at a fast-moving plane, you're trying to hit a small target moving at hundreds of miles per hour, thousands of feet in the air. Your shell has maybe a second of flight time. If you're off by just a few degrees, the shell sails harmlessly past the target and explodes somewhere in empty sky, or worse, doesn't explode at all. Before 1940, gunners had 2 options. They could use contact fuses, which only exploded if the shell directly hit the aircraft. The problem, the odds of a direct hit on a maneuvering plane were roughly 1 in several thousand rounds. Or they could use timed fuses, which were set to explode at a specific altitude based on calculations of where the plane would be. The problem with timed fuses, if your calculation was off by even half a second, the shell exploded too early or too late. Modern aircraft could change altitude and direction so quickly that timed fuses were almost useless. Pilots learned to simply watch for the shell bursts and maneuver away. The result? Anti-aircraft guns were frighteningly ineffective. Ships were vulnerable. Cities were defenseless. Bombers ruled the sky. What the Navy needed was a shell that could detect when it was near a target and explode automatically. A fuse that didn't require perfect aim or perfect timing. A fuse that turned near misses into kills. The idea wasn't new. People had been proposing proximity fuses since the 1930s. The Germans had dozens of designs under development. The British had been working on the concept since 1939. Everyone knew it was theoretically possible. The problem was actually building it. In summer 1940, physicist Merle Tuve was given an impossible assignment. Develop a working proximity fuse for the Navy's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. Not a prototype, not a proof of concept, an actual fuse that could be mass-produced and used in combat. Tuve looked at the requirements and realized he was being asked to do something that violated every principle of electronics engineering. The fuse had to contain a miniature radio transmitter and a receiver. It had to have a battery, an antenna, and electronic circuits. It had to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch shell, and then, here's where it got crazy, it had to survive being fired from a cannon. When a 5-inch gun fires, the shell experiences acceleration of 20,000 times the force of gravity. 20,000 Gs. For comparison, a fighter pilot pulling a hard turn experiences about 9 Gs and risks blacking out. The fuse would experience forces more than 2,000 times greater. And that wasn't all. The rifling in the gun barrel spun the shell at nearly 30,000 revolutions per minute. The fuse had to work while spinning 500 times per second and being subjected to forces that would instantly crush any normal electronic device. Oh, and one more thing. It had to cost less than $50 to manufacture. Mass production meant cheap production.
Most engineers would have said it was impossible. Tuve said he'd have a working prototype in 6 months. The heart of the proximity fuse was a vacuum tube, basically a tiny light bulb with electronic components inside. The problem? Vacuum tubes were fragile. They were made of glass. They contained delicate filaments that snapped under stress. Every single vacuum tube manufacturer in America told Tuve the same thing. There was no way a vacuum tube could survive being fired from a gun. Tuve didn't accept that answer. His team began modifying miniature tubes originally designed for hearing aids. They experimented with different glass thicknesses, different filament designs, different mounting techniques. They fired prototype after prototype from test guns and examined the wreckage, looking for clues about what it failed and why. Months passed. Hundreds of prototypes shattered. The team was burning through its budget with nothing to show for it. Some of the scientists wanted to try a different approach, maybe acoustic sensors, maybe photoelectric cells, maybe something other than radio. Tuve refused. Radio was the only technology that could work in all weather conditions, day or night, against any target. Then in early 1941, they had a breakthrough. A modified tube survived the firing. Then another. Then a dozen in a row. They'd found the right combination of materials and design. The vacuum tubes could work. But that was just one problem solved. The fuse still needed a battery that could activate instantly when the shell was fired. It needed an antenna that wouldn't break off. It needed a circuit that could differentiate between a real target and false returns from the ground or sea. It needed a safety mechanism so it wouldn't explode prematurely and kill the gun crew. The battery problem was particularly elegant. Normal batteries stored in a shell would degrade over time. The team's solution: install the battery dry with the electrolyte in a glass vial. When the shell was fired, the tremendous acceleration would shatter the vial and distribute the liquid through the battery cells. The battery would activate itself the instant the shell left the gun barrel. The antenna was another piece of clever engineering. It couldn't stick out. That would break off instantly. So they made the entire nose of the shell part of the antenna assembly, using the shell's metal casing as part of the radio circuit. By January 1942, they had a working fuse. The T3 model had a 52% success rate against water targets. That meant half the time it worked. Half the time, it didn't. The Navy looked at that 52% number and said, "Good enough. Mass production begins immediately." That's how desperate they were for a solution to the aircraft problem. A fuse that failed half the time was still infinitely better than what they had before. That summer, the USS Cleveland tested the improved design in Chesapeake Bay. 4 shells, 3 drones destroyed. The test was canceled not because it failed, but because it worked so well there was nothing left to test. By September 1942, Crossley Corporation in Cincinnati was manufacturing proximity fuses on an assembly line. By the end of 1943, they were producing 40,000 fuses per day. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day from factories across America. But nobody could use them. The proximity fuse was classified at the same level as the Manhattan Project. Soldiers weren't told how it worked. Captured fuses would give the Germans and Japanese the secret, so the Pentagon absolutely forbade their use over enemy territory where duds might be recovered. The first combat use came in January 1943 off Guadalcanal. The USS Helena was under attack by Japanese dive bombers. One Val bomber completed his run and was pulling away when Helena's aft 5-inch battery fired 3 shells with proximity fuses. The shells didn't hit the bomber. They didn't need to. They exploded near it, and the Val disintegrated from shrapnel damage. The bomber crashed into the sea. Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding Helena's aft gun battery, had just made history, the first confirmed proximity fuse kill of an enemy aircraft. The results across the Pacific were immediate and shocking. Before proximity fuses, ships required an average of over 1,000 rounds to shoot down a single attacking aircraft. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to about 300 rounds. Against kamikaze attacks where planes came in fast and low with no time for multiple salvos, proximity fuses were the difference between life and death. In 1944, when Germany began launching V-1 flying bombs at London, Churchill initially refused to use the American proximity fuses. They were unproven British technology. They might fall into German hands. British engineers were skeptical. Then the V-1s started getting through. 100 per day were hitting London. Churchill personally overrode the objections and ordered proximity-fused ammunition rushed to the anti-aircraft batteries defending southern England.
The results were staggering. In the first week of attacks, British gunners using timed fuses destroyed 24% of incoming V-1s. After switching to proximity fuses, they were destroying 79% of them. The V-1 went from an unstoppable terror weapon to target practice. But the Pentagon still refused to allow proximity fuses over land, terrified that the Germans would capture one and copy the design. German engineers had been working on their own proximity fuses since the 1930s, but Hitler had canceled the program in 1940, declaring that any weapon that couldn't be ready in 6 months was a waste of resources. If the Germans got hold of an American fuse, they might restart their program, and if German 88mm flak guns started using proximity fuses, Allied bomber losses would triple. Thousands of airmen would die. General Dwight Eisenhower was furious. He had the best artillery fuse ever invented and couldn't use it because some Pentagon bureaucrat was afraid of what might happen. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower demanded authorization to use proximity fuses in ground combat. The Pentagon finally agreed. 200,000 shells with VT fuses were rushed to the Ardennes. The German army had never encountered anything like it. They were used to Allied artillery shells exploding on impact with the ground, giving them warning and allowing them to take cover. Soldiers in trenches were relatively safe. Troops caught in the open could hit the dirt and survive. Proximity fuses changed everything. Now the shells were exploding 20 to 50 feet above the ground, showering entire areas with shrapnel. There was no cover. There was no safe distance. The shells were exploding directly over German positions before anyone even heard them coming. German soldiers began refusing orders to leave their bunkers during artillery bombardments. Officers reported acts of mutiny. Men who had fought for years on the Eastern Front said they'd never seen anything as terrifying as these new shells that exploded in midair. General Patton wrote a letter to the War Department describing an incident where American artillery caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer River.
A single battalion concentration, a few minutes of focused fire, killed 702 German soldiers by actual count. 702 men, dead in minutes from one artillery bombardment. Patton concluded his letter with a warning. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad that you all thought of it first. The Germans never did figure it out. They captured intact proximity fuses. Duds were inevitable, but by the time they examined them, the war was nearly over. German scientists looked at the miniature vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 Gs and admitted they were at least a decade behind American electronics technology. By war end, over 22 million proximity fuses had been manufactured at a cost of more than $1 billion 1940s dollars, roughly $15 billion in today's money. They were used in shells, bombs, and rockets. They shot down thousands of aircraft, destroyed German ground forces, and saved London from the V-1 attacks. Admiral Lewis Strauss, who oversaw parts of the program, later wrote, "The fuse had proved to be the most ingenious and effective single instrument developed for the conduct of the war." Merle Tuve, the physicist who said he could build an impossible device in 6 months and then actually did it, never sought recognition. He went back to pure research after the war. Most Americans never learned his name. But every Japanese pilot who dove on an American ship and was torn apart by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire knew what Tuve had created. Every German soldier caught in the open during an artillery barrage knew it. Every V-1 that exploded over the English Channel instead of over London knew it. The proximity fuse was the weapon that turned near misses into kills, the device that made anti-aircraft guns actually work, the technology that one Pentagon official called the second most important secret of World War II, after the atomic bomb. And it started with a test on a calm August morning in the Chesapeake Bay, when 3 small drone aircraft were destroyed by 4 shells that never actually hit them. The Navy canceled the rest of the 2-day test. There was nothing left to prove.